actually COVID hit, we started doing that with my own team back in January, mapping out. It's total chaos, information overload, but we have to organize this into a framework that we can put decision-making into that's grounded in the science, just like we did with the schools work in Mexico, and we were doing with U.S. Green Building Council and your Center for Green Schools, to make some sense of it, to bring the evidence base to it, with the ultimate goal of leading to change in the market, right? It's not just science for science sake. It's how do we lead to this permanent change in the market. And it's really interesting. You know, one of my favorite things is when you came and spoke to one of our student groups on the Built Environment and Health Research Consortium. And you said, you know what academic journals are? It's where great research goes to die. And I loved it because all of my students took a breath, like, you know, to us, peer-reviewed journals, that's it. You publish that's our job. And actually I get judged on that daily, right? We publish, that's great. But that's not the end of it. And I think, to get back to your first comment, this is what we're seeing right now in this moment. It's public health's moment, and public health is about research translation. You know, you call me a generalist, maybe, you know, I'm in this healthy buildings movement, certainly, but my academic title is professor of exposure assessment science. That's exposure and risk. And first and foremost, I'm a public health scientist. And so it's our duty, not just to do the research, but to translate that research so that into actionable steps people can take. And I know that's exactly what you were doing when we first met, trying to figure out how do we do the same thing for schools and hit all these other levers, ground it in science, we can affect that change.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of what makes you so special as a researcher. And I know that you have had pressures throughout to become a specialist, as so many academics do. You've really bucked that expectation. And you've been dealing with a range of subjects from airplanes to building schools, Broadway, e-cigs, you know, all over the place. And I feel like one of the reasons why we've seen your work evolve in that way is because do you feel like it would be safe to say you're a purpose-driven researcher? Like, you start from this premise of, like, what is it that we could do to really make change? You know, could we touch that holy grail and show that a green building amounts to healthier people, and then mapping back? And I feel like a lot of researchers are instructed not to think that way. Like, somehow that starting with an objective that you want to prove cannibalizes the research itself. Do you want to talk a little bit about that different approach?
Yeah, you know, it all comes back to, honestly, it's my first day at Harvard, and one of my deans said to me, and I had to answer this question: how will your research impact the world? And I stopped. And I talk to my students about this all the time. You know, I think being at Harvard is a special privilege. It is a trusted brand. We have a big responsibility to act appropriately, have it grounded in good science, and people look to that brand, right? So we put up that phrase in my lab on the first day: how will your research impact the world? And I have the world's best team of researchers. And we talk about this, and we step back from our work regularly to say, are we thinking big enough here? And if we're not, we have to change that. It's my job to free them up and say, well, let's think as big as we can, and then I will figure out how we fund this. But that should never be the barrier. And normally it is the barrier, right? You put in 5 grants, maybe 1 lands, you do that work, even if it's not the thing you think will be the most impactful. So we flip that approach. And everyone on my team will tell you, you know, we often start with that end result. What do you think the headline is if we do this work and do it well, and we think this result would happen? What would that headline be? And you need to understand that, because then that's who you're trying to influence. I think we're really good at study design. Everyone in public health can do this, right? We're good at biostatistics. We can pull up any study we want. The trick is, which is the right study? And so it's really one of the reasons I loved interacting with you all and Rick and others, going back and working with industry partners, is because a lot of times I'm presenting like this. What I'm really doing is I'm listening carefully to the questions that come in. What is the market? What are they stumped on? What is the thing that if they just had some empirical evidence would move the needle on whatever it is, green buildings, e-cigs, whatever it is. And then so that's kind of our approach. And instead of becoming specialists, I encourage all my doctoral students to say, you know, you're going to dive deep in this topic. But by virtue of being in this larger group that researches, you know, 15 to 20 different projects at a time, we'll become specialists. So you can apply these skills to any situation that comes next. You don't just leave here with an expertise in some minor, important, but small part of public health.
Yeah, I love that. Rick always says you start from the press release and you work your way back. And Rick's a marketing guy, so that works really well in marketing, but I love that you've taken a lot of that ethos and applied it to research. I want to come back to public-private partnerships because I think that's a big part of your genius and your success. And another thing that we share in common, this notion that like nonprofits and academic institutions don't own exclusive rights on doing good in the world. So I want to come back to some of those innovations, but I feel like we need to get to the topic that's on everybody's mind right now, which is COVID-19 and the global pandemic. So let me start with just a broad question. What's your assessment of how we're doing? You've been a part of forecasting from the very beginning, trying to anticipate what the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, what scenario are we seeing playing out, and where do you think we're going to go from here?
Yeah, so that's I'd say the $1 million question, but it's the $1 trillion question, really. Look, I'd say things were doing really well. I'm really proud of my colleagues in public health, and not just at my school. I think across the board, public health has really stepped up and shown its value here in being able to work through this science quickly and translate it and help inform decision making, which of course goes beyond public health, right? So I think that's working well. Of course, it could have been done better had we gotten on this earlier. We knew pandemics were coming. I wrote an editorial in December about healthy buildings, and in that editorial, talk about the potential for pandemics. And so it's not like we knew this would happen then, but certainly we knew a pandemic was coming, and the public health community has been talking about this for a while. Where we've really failed, at least U.S.-centric here, is we've been really slow to do the things we know we need to do to keep people safe and get our economy going. So it's been many months. Other countries have been effective at doing this, but we've been quite slow. And I wrote about this in an article in USA Today with a colleague at Harvard Kennedy School, Julia Kayyem, where we talk about this. It must be 3 or 4 weeks old at this point, that there is a plan. We know it works, and we just need to execute it. And every expert is talking about the plan in different language, and that was what motivated that piece. This idea of, it's from E.O. Wilson, another Harvard professor, of consilience. And consilience is when people of different disciplines align on a common solution. That's consilience. And we have that. We know what we have to do. It's a handful of things, and we haven't been executing it. I will give you some optimism or hope. I think this is the month we turn that corner. For the first time in history, every scientist in the world is focused on one problem. It is inevitable that solutions will come. And if you're reading, and I mean below the headline, we're not going to see the headline, cancer cured, COVID cured. If you read under the headline, each day, these mini scientific breakthroughs, each enormous in their own right, are happening. And they're adding up. And the pace and intensity or frequency of these breakthroughs is such that I think this is the month where they'll start to add up and start to have a really big effect. Well before this vaccine, we're going to have to learn how to live with this and manage it before this vaccine comes. So there it is. I don't think we've done a great job for the first 3 months. I'm optimistic now. I don't think it's the green light time. I think the science is clear. We're going to have to manage this carefully for a longer time, including a potential seasonal forcing come November, December. But I'm optimistic we will be able to manage this. And these breakthroughs are coming across scientific, medical, even basic things like contact tracing that we need.
Hi, Joe. Can I ask you a question here? There's a lot of people out there that talk about phase 3 trials for the vaccine, right? So in public health, this means we need to go through multiple phases in order to be able to prove it, the gold standard. When it comes to buildings and health, it plays a really critical role, and you've been an advocate for the role that buildings play in the fight against COVID and what we can do preventatively. And I really like some of the quotes that you've had recently with the Harvard Business Review article to talk about how buildings need a checkup now, right? So just like humans do, let's not wait, right, until something's the problem. And you have a long history of investigating buildings that are sick buildings. But let's get in front of this and look at how buildings can be preventative in nature. And we have a lot of questions from our community of thousands of people joining. How do we perform that checkup on buildings? What do we need to know from our buildings now? What can we do phase 1 to get in there preventatively and provide a checkup? And then also, I think something that we really advocate a lot with the Well Building Standard is we have a community of experts around the world that do a lot of performance testing in buildings. You've talked a little bit about commissioning, but we do require people go on site and perform over 60 tests in buildings. Can you talk a little bit about what can buildings do now in the fight against COVID? And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the data, the checkup that buildings need, and what kind of information we need to be capturing and the role that we need to be playing as buildings in part of the fight against COVID-19.
Yeah, that's great, Whitney. I mean, this is a question everybody has, and I think of it in a couple different stages. So first is, for buildings right now that are many are at low occupancy, there are some things you need to do, including commissioning your building systems to get it ready for higher occupancy. Not high occupancy just yet, but higher occupancy. And I've written about this, and I'm happy to talk about this, but this includes things beyond those factors that are related to COVID-19. For example, the water in your buildings is quite stagnant by this point. This is a breeding ground for biologicals, including things like Legionella, bacteria that can be aerosolized and cause pneumonia. So we have to be thinking about, getting these buildings started back. More to your question, I think, is, we get them going and we make these tweaks, these healthy building strategies we employ that we know can be effective at reducing disease transmission or minimizing risk. It's one part of an overall strategy, and we can talk more about the overall strategy. But key to that, to your point about a checkup, is you have to verify that the building is performing like you think it's performing. This is fundamentally what commissioning is. It's making sure you get the building you paid for and your systems are performing as they should. So it's a critical step in that we know leads to better indoor air quality performance. Related to that is the need for testing. You call it performance testing, right? So indoor environmental quality testing. I did this for years at my firm. This is the only way. In the book, we call it keeping the pulse of the building. So it fits right in with the checkup idea. You go into the doctor's office, what do? First thing, no matter what you're there for, they check your pulse, they check your blood pressure, right? Every single time. These are the basics of understanding how physiologically we perform before we dive deeper. Same thing with buildings. You check the pulse of the building by doing indoor environmental quality monitoring. This includes real-time monitoring for some indicators of air quality performance and building performance, as well as supplemented with more traditional, we call it industrial hygiene techniques. You go out and collect an air sample, you send it to a lab, you get your data back. We have to pair it with those traditional techniques because we can't measure everything we want in real time just yet. So for example, water quality, there's really no way around it other than going out and taking a sample of water. But even there are indicators that you can test that give you a hint that maybe the building isn't performing as planned. And as we know, buildings change fast. The building, if we were all in the same room, it would change by the time we leave that room. It changes every day, every hour, and certainly over years. So if you're not taking the pulse of your building, you have no idea how it's performing. And in the book, we make the case with my co-author, John McCumber here, that when you're not doing that, money is going out the door in terms of people's performance, productivity, willingness to be at your company even. And now in a COVID world, I mean, the economic argument making, saying that these productivity benefits are way beyond the costs of air quality testing or checkups. Well, in a COVID world, that's just blown up orders of magnitude even greater, right? I mean, we all know, who wants to go back to any building right now that isn't a healthy building? Well, I have no intention of going back to a building unless it's a healthy building. I'm going to look at my space differently. And I think about these things all the time. So the checkup has to be part of it. And there are things you should be doing right now while you're in that low occupancy phase.
And I have to ask you, Joe, about sensors. So we talk a lot about, making the invisible visible. There's a lot of people who walk into a building, even a couple months ago, and just assumed the air quality was good. So how do you make the invisible visible for people? And often that is through data. So that makes them feel empowered that they understand more about their space, and then they can make the decisions they need to for their health. There's been a lot of conversation about making the invisible visible, making it actionable. We're seeing a lot more information on sensors. And Vic Garnias, who we recently interviewed for this webcast, said that not all data is information. So, who's the translator? What is good information? How are we using data more powerfully as people are returning to work? And if you had any comments on sensors, we'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, this is the big trick, and I've heard a lot of companies talking about this, and currently I think there are some offerings in the market where, you put out some sensors and you get data, but what do you do with that data and how do you interpret it? And I think this is the next big gap. I mean, this is what my team and I do all the time, and I talk about it in my class, how do you handle that data and make sense of it? And it's not so straightforward. But there are ways to do it. So this is that next leap that has to take place to say, I got all this data, now turn it into something actionable. And to your point is, then you have to communicate So that can all be done. The sensor technology is improving. There's some things that you can measure really well and some things that are marginal, and there's some things that are not good at the moment. But they're going to keep getting better. I mean, there's no doubt that this is where the market is headed. On the communications front, I've been talking to some executives talking about already companies are innovating. We're an innovation economy. And the companies that are thinking, well, I'm going to go back, just get this economy back. I got to get back to what it was like in January. Well, you're behind at that point. Already companies, and I mean big companies and little companies, already thinking, well, we're learning some efficiencies here. This is a terrible situation, but we're going to do things differently going forward. And you should be thinking that way around your buildings too, even in terms of the monitoring or technology you want to have in place. I've talked to some commercial real estate leaders who are saying, you know what, the first thing I'm doing to make it visible is creating a scorecard with my buildings. That's very much similar to what you have in certification. They're going to make it a sign on the door. These are the 10 things we're doing to protect your health in the age of COVID-19. 9 of them you can't see, but we want to let you know why they're important. And importantly, not just it's Joe's idea, or Rick's idea, or Rachel's idea. No, it's grounded in the science. Here's what we know about how we're exposed to this virus. These are the proven interventions based on the science. And that's why we're taking steps in our building that meet that. So it's grounded, it has to be grounded in the fundamental underlying science on intervention and controls.
So there's a lot of questions coming in and a lot of questions in general we're hearing from our community about what does return to work look like? And we've been saying that thanks to our team members in China. We've got more than 20 of them. We've kind of been living through this situation and fast forward. And so I was super surprised to hear from one of our colleagues in Shanghai who said, things are kind of almost back to normal. Like most people are wearing masks, but handshakes and hugs are back in fashion. And one of our other colleagues sent us a picture of a super crowded dining room in Shanghai where everybody's wearing a mask, but people are sitting elbow to elbow. So is it really going to be as different as we're talking about when we all start transitioning back to work? Will we be sitting 6 feet apart and doing the no touching thing for, in perpetuity?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, at least in the US right now, based on where we are in this stage of the pandemic and looking at the models that suggest as we kind of tamper this down at great expense to our economy and many lives have been lost, we've flattened the curve. And what we do next will determine if that stays flat or if we spike again. So we're not at that, in my opinion, we're not at that point where these controls should be relaxed. We still are at the physical distancing, hand washing, and public health. You shouldn't even be that close to people for years. Some people in infectious disease doing the elbow bump instead of the handshake. I think return to work is going to be very different in the US for some time. First, even if we get to the point where you're a building owner or a company, you say, we did everything we could, we feel good about our building and our space, these are the controls that are in place. Public sentiment right now is not there. Some poll came at 80% of people don't want to go back to work. People aren't going to go back to sports events until there's a vaccine. 70 or 80% responded that. So however you want to reopen, whatever that means, and it's going to vary by region, if people aren't ready to go back, they're not going to be ready to go back. I can talk, yeah, good.
Well, I was just going to ask you, so if organizations, or rather individuals within organizations, have the ability to work remotely, should we be trying to go back to work in like a 6 feet apart paradigm when the risk is still elevated, or should we all just sit tight?
Not yet. So here's the approach I put forward on CNN a couple weeks ago, and this is what I wrote up with my co-author of the book in Harvard Business Review this week, is this layered defense approach that talks about work from home. So this comes from the hierarchy of controls. This is something we've done in occupational health and safety for decades, and it has 5 parts. And the first one is you eliminate the hazard. We use this, imagine an industrial facility where you have a chemical that's toxic. Well, the first thing you want to do is try to eliminate it. So this applies to industrial environments, but what we've done here is applied to COVID. So eliminate the hazard in this for COVID means work from home. Companies should be trying work from home strategies while they can, while the risks are high and we have low population immunity. The next step is substitution in this hierarchy. Here you want to substitute personnel. So who are the core people, the minimum core people that have to be physically back in your building in order to keep it operational and running, right? You can identify those people. And then you can put in other controls too, so you can isolate different work groups. So if one person gets sick in a team of 5, the whole company doesn't go down, right? So you have to be careful there. The third one is engineering controls in the hierarchy of controls. These are healthy building strategies. Higher ventilation rates, more filtration, maybe use of portable air purifiers. Enhanced disinfection and cleaning. Fourth one is administrative controls. This is going to take collaboration and coordination between the building owner and the tenant. How do you de-densify your building? How are you going to handle queues at the elevator? How can you go to shifts, extend the workday, have A/B days, split up into these teams? So the administrative controls are key. And fifth one is PPE, or personal protective equipment, like mask wearing in places like elevators or common areas. No, not one of these strategies alone is sufficient by itself. So we have to layer them, right? And there's no risk, but if we layer enough of these on, we can get to a place where we have minimized risk sufficiently that we would feel good even opening up the building. And then if we communicate it effectively, maybe you, seeing what the building has done, will say, okay, now I feel comfortable going back because they have these controls in place and they're monitoring it. Yep.
Let's jump ahead a little bit to the workplace of the future. Because in the design community especially, there's a lot of talk, same with property managers, are saying like open offices are going away, co-working spaces are going away, we're never going to touch or talk to each other again. Like, how much of this is going to be long lasting, and what are some of the concerns that you have if we keep some of these practices in place, from increased social isolation to an overuse of antimicrobial, antibacterial hand sanitizers and so forth?
Yeah, you know, there's a way back here that doesn't, that we can be smart and follow prudent, take prudent actions, right? I've written a couple of pieces with Mark Lipsitch at Harvard School of Public Health, you know, a renowned epidemiologist. He's someone everyone should be following. And he says, look, we have to get smart here without pandemic theater. And that motivated our article in the Washington Post about after we saw these parks being closed to say, whoa, let's step back and look at this from my field is exposure and risk assessment. So you might be called as a generalist, but really it's about applying these exposure and risk principles to any topic. And that motivated that article on, you know, keeping parks open right here for mental health and physical health benefits we get. So we have to be mindful here that we don't take actions that are pandemic theater. And by no means am I minimizing this in any way. We just have to be smart about it. So when I think about buildings, you know, a lot of people are talking about the open floor plan. Is this the end of open floor plan? I think the only certainty there is that people will ask questions about it. I'm not convinced that that's the end of open floor plans. Like anything, there's a good and a bad way to do it. I feel quite confident that given an open floor plan, I could help and others could help figure out control strategies where you could minimize risk. Look, even simple things. If you and I are in cubicles and we're facing each other, can we just stagger, offset just a little bit? Do you have these engineering controls in place? Is your disinfection protocol sufficient? Can you put up even a small barrier that prevents droplet transmission? So if you factor all of these in together, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean one system versus another is inherently bad or problematic. It's how you handle it and address it. Yeah, open floor plan could be terrible if you cram too many people together and you break the physical distancing rules and your building mechanical system isn't bringing enough fresh outdoor air. But if you take some of these smart steps, it can be managed.
I want to ask you a question about 6 feet apart, because somehow this 6 feet has become gospel. But I feel like what's behind that from an evidence perspective looks a little bit like Wells' portion control feature, where we know that portion control matters for addressing obesity, but nobody ever told you exactly how big the plates and the bowls were supposed to be. So how much hard science is there behind this notion of 6 feet as like the right space that we should be putting between ourselves, our colleagues, or ourselves and our friends?
Yeah, so like anything, there's nuance, but it's largely driven from sound science, and it's basic aerosol physics that's driving it, and this idea that we have 3 modes of transmission: large droplet, fomite transmission, and airborne, which itself is a false construct. It's a continuum. I do like the message that's gotten out there, because I think if all the nuance comes out and we talk like every scientist wants to talk out, well, no one's going to know what the heck to do. We all know it's 6 feet now. Good. That's like the minimum starting point. You want to go further? Great. Don't go closer than 6 feet. It's grounded in this idea that, look, if I'm infectious and I can be asymptomatic, feeling fine, even when I'm talking right now or just breathing, I'm emitting aerosols, right? Large droplets or large aerosols, you might even see if you see a singer, right? They spit when they're singing. You'll see those. But there are also larger aerosols that are not visible, that are still large from a physics standpoint, and those settle out pretty quickly, most of them within 6 feet. Some of them, of course, will travel beyond that, and some of them will stay airborne and go way beyond that. So it's a good practice. That should be a minimum. Look, if someone's yelling or singing or a jogger, it's like you can spew that a lot further. If I cough, a powerful cough can go 20 feet or more. So it's imperfect like everything. There's nuance like everything, but as a general practice, yeah, it's a minimum. Physical distancing is 6 feet is good practice, helps to eliminate droplet transmission, and that should be the minimum starting point.
So Joe,
I said I'm going to get rich by launching a selfie stick, but it's really just like a 6 foot long stick. So we can just like each hold it on one side and always know we're staying 6 feet apart. So stay tuned for my $1 billion idea. Whitney?
Thank you. Well, Joe, I'd like some inspiration from you. I think a lot of people are reacting, which means there was a way I used to live and I can't live that way anymore. Therefore, the new way is bad. When we look at the history of epidemics and public health, designers actually have provided incredible inspiration for us. We have relearned and we've reshaped the way that we've lived based on infectious and chronic diseases. I know you often cite the history of public health. I'd love you to spend a little time inspiring our audiences, in particular around how can we take this opportunity to rethink about the role buildings play. And I want to add a little caveat, is that urban planners and designers and architects, we used to work real close together. I always joke that we used to date in high school. And then we went to college, broke up, and now we got back together and got married because in the 1950s, here comes polio, germ theory, infectious disease, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, individuals, heavily focused. And some people say, and I would agree, we lost sight of the role of buildings and the environment, right? And we sort of separated, if you will, went to college. And then we really see in the last several decades this return to saying, no, we have to look at buildings, we have to look at places, we have to look at the environment in order to better understand how to address chronic diseases. So I'd love you to just sort of comment on the history of public health when we're dealing with epidemics, things that we've learned, in particular that we shouldn't be separated, that we deeply need to be working together now more than ever, and maybe how this opportunity can inspire our audience to think differently about how buildings play a role in our health moving forward.
Yeah, so nice question. So this is an area that really gets me going a little bit. So I'll temper just a little bit, but maybe I'll even take it a step further and think it's not just design architects and what's happening on the standard setting, but also what's happening in business, right? And even employees. So you can ask any business owner or person, any big business, who's responsible for the health, for health broadly in your company? Like, who is the person? The CEO? Someone at HR? Who is that? And I think if you don't know that answer right away, that points to a problem. Second, who's responsible for the building and the health of the building? And that answer, largely nobody knows. Facilities, I don't know, okay, yeah, that's energy, I'm in sustainability, I don't know who's responsible for the health of the building. So there's a disconnect even currently right now in the building. But historically, going back, it wasn't always this way. I talk about in my presentations about people, great scientists like Florence Nightingale and Alice Hamilton, Harvard's first female faculty, who talked about the importance of air in disease transmission. And so this is nothing new, right? We've known this for a long time. In fact, if you go back to the early 1900s, how are our ventilation standards set? Outdoor air quality, how much fresh outdoor air comes in? They were based on disease transmission. We lost our way there. Along the way. So in the 1970s, right, energy crisis, we tighten up our building envelopes. Now it becomes an energy thing. And I'm not diminishing the importance of energy conservation, right, in this picture, but at the same time, we can't sacrifice health. And so we tighten up our buildings. We overreact the other way. We moved away from what Lord Norman Foster calls breathable buildings, right? We start choking off the air supply, and we get the era of sick buildings, and that's where we are now. So, but we're going to have to get back to that other paradigm where buildings are built for health, and these standards are set not as engineering standards, not as minimum standards, but healthy standards designed for health and beyond infectious disease transmission. And we know the evidence is deep. 40 years of scientific evidence. All of my colleagues across this space of healthy buildings, indoor air quality for years have been doing this work. My mentor, Jack Spengler, has been doing this since the 80s, 70s on the benefits of better buildings, including more fresh outdoor air. So we've known this for a long time, and it has been this quite unbelievable disconnect. But I'm hopeful because the market's moving ahead of that, right? People are recognizing it and saying, well, we're just going to move ahead, and we're going to make these decisions beyond, let's say, code minimum, because we know it's the right thing and we know there's a business benefit to it. So I'm hopeful that that's where it's going. And what COVID-19 has done, like in everything in terms of telecommuting and technology, it has sped up the processes that were already happening. This healthy building movement was happening, right? It's clear. Maybe it was going to take another 5 or 6 years to really take off. Well, guess what? It took off in the past 2 months. The number of people that are calling me who used to be on the sidelines here saying, hey, what do we do differently? And I don't mean differently this week or this month. I'm talking about coming out of this. What should we be doing? We're building a new building. What should we be thinking about here? So this has accelerated. So I'm hopeful that past problems, maybe the past 30 or 40 years, we've switched and turned the corner.
Same in terms of just tons of people who have been on the sidelines or slightly skeptical. You know, we're definitely in a whole new normal here. I want to stay on this topic about that potential tension between a green building and a healthy building. You know, you mentioned it in terms of talking about, you know, closing up all of the buildings in an effort to drive toward energy efficiency and the consequences of that. Rick has referred to the healthy buildings movement as the second wave of sustainability. And you know that IWBI thinks of it very much as a yes and, not an either or. And in fact, we think planetary health and the health of people are inextricable. Now is an amazing moment for proving that. There's a woman who said on the line today, who said her asthma has gone away completely since starting to work from home. And we've been seeing all kinds of reports on how much better the air quality is from city to city all across the world because people aren't moving around as much. Construction is stalled. I think I've felt as though there's this almost like sub-narrative within both movements that somehow wants to put healthy buildings and green buildings in opposition, to say like it's really hard to do both. Those are very much in tension. We'll have to sacrifice energy efficiency for air quality. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely not. It's a total false dichotomy. It drives me a bit crazy too. So you figured out all my buttons. Maybe that's intentional. But I really like Rick's framing, right? This is the second wave. Look, we're talking about health. We're talking about health. In the building, in the book, we talk about health beyond the four walls. We dedicate an entire chapter to this, actually more, into saying these things can and actually have to operate in tandem. It is not an either or proposition. That is a false narrative. We actually give guidelines in the book on how you can do that. And first of all, we have to think about the system too. And we're going to have to get to a clean energy system very soon. Talk about a slow rolling crisis, right? We have a slow rolling crisis right now and the next one's coming. And so we're going to have to get there, but buildings have their role to play too. And you can actually have energy. A healthy building can be energy efficient too. In fact, they have to be. And so what we do in the book is actually not just say, well, here's our idea, and we think that's a good idea. We quantify that for you. We say, look, if you take these steps, you can actually save energy and do everything you need to do on a healthy building side and still come out ahead on the bottom line. And you can quantify it. You can use this. We have this tool we call COBE, developed at Harvard, Co-Benefits of the Built Environment, that lets you quantify the health benefits of your energy saving. So it's not just carbon or, how many kilotons of carbon. Well, I can't interpret that intuitively, but I can interpret that translates into fewer deaths, fewer missed school days, fewer missed work days, which is what this tool does. It turns it back into a public health metric. Now, energy efficiency is a public health metric. Indoor environmental quality is not just, well, some nebulous, CO2. I don't know what that means in here. No, we turn that into empirical evidence on benefits to people and performance. And then you can wrap all that up into an economic argument like Rick's been talking about for a long time with his book, Greenthink. There's actually a business benefit here. And it's almost, there should be no barrier to adopting healthy building strategies, like zero. There should be zero barriers to adopting these strategies.
There also seems to be a growing movement within the green building world to say that green buildings are the same as healthy buildings. And to me, it reminds me a little bit of like 2007 when I started at USGBC, where a lot of the energy efficiency community was saying, we're green buildings. And I think our perspective was, for sure, energy efficient buildings are greener buildings, but maybe they're not covering the whole span. You are probably one of the most prolific authors on the topic of the relationship between green buildings and healthy buildings. Are green buildings healthier buildings? Do we even need multiple labels, or are they just one and the same?
Well, look, I mean, the green building movement has been wildly successful. And there's so much to cover in that strategy. So I feel like, should I be talking to you all about the green building movement, right? You could go on and on about this forever. So I feel kind of silly talking about it. But there's only so much you can dedicate to health. And in my opinion, it's a smaller fraction of what encompasses health in a building, right? At Harvard, we call the 9 foundations of a healthy building. All of these factors that the science says lead to better benefits. Maybe you could squeeze that all into green building, but green building, is doing a great job on energy, wastewater with a nod to human health. That's important. That's good. It's the first step, right? So there's room for this. In fact, there has to be. I wouldn't say it's enough to say, well, I'm a LEED certified building. That means I'm all done with health here. I don't think that's the case. There's a lot more to do and a lot more to be done. I think the environment we're in right now is showing that, right? We should be thinking about buildings as the first layer of defense in this fight against infectious disease, including COVID-19.
Ooh, let's talk about that. Buildings as the first line of defense, because you and I are both definitely of the mindset that buildings themselves and those that tend to them are going to be the next frontline caregivers as we enter into this recovery phase. There's a ton of questions that are coming in about your perspectives on the most promising technologies. So UV, air filtration, air purifiers, sensors, something I had never heard of, MCI, multi-cluster ionization. What are the most promising new technologies, or if not new, then technologies that aren't widely being used that you think that people should be looking into?
All right, so that's a really good question. I'm advising a couple of companies in this space. So let me first say, I think we have to be careful, first and foremost, because how it works in a lab is one thing, how it works in practice is another, and how effective it can be against disease transmission may be another. That's not to say there's not a role for technology. I believe there is. The other part I would say is this, at least in the guidance I'd be giving now, it's more along the lines of what can everybody do in every building today to minimize risk. It is not, in a year from now, if you outfit your building with some new technology, you'll be okay. That's not satisfactory to me. In fact, it's similar to, I wrote another article in the Washington Post about mask wearing and talking about, look, there's a shortage. Not everyone's going to run around with an N95, but there is something everybody has in their house, mostly. 100% cotton t-shirt. And if you look at the data, that can be effective. So we have to come up with these solutions right now that are not, you have to spend money and solve this going forward. There are things you can do right now. There is a role for technology to play. We should be thinking about how we're redesigning or outfitting next capital improvement, what we might be targeting. Again, here I'd say it has to be targeted to risk. So which mode of transmission are you trying to attack? How does it lead to a benefit above and beyond? For example, higher ventilation rates, or simple things in increasing the efficiency of the filter in the recirculated air. If your system can't handle that pressure drop and you need another way to address that, well, then maybe you could start to think about these other technologies. We have to be careful. Some technologies may produce secondary unintended byproducts that we have to be careful about. We don't want to solve one problem and introduce another. So without getting into details about these, I think technology definitely has a role to play. I think we have to be careful in terms of the application and applying it back to the science and also the risk profile. What may work or be necessary in a hospital waiting room is going to be different from what's needed in a commercial space or even a school.
So Joe, you love the term risk. I'd also love to talk about resiliency. So a large part of this disease is also looking at the immunity of the host, resiliency of the host. And there's been more attention to saying we also need to think about how buildings can increase overall resiliency, right? So this has to do with eating well. This has to do with access to, spaces that are healthy for us to be in, connection to people. And the reason I bring it up is because a lot of building code, to your point, historically, has been about risk, about reducing risk and problems. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on going beyond code. And, we work clearly with voluntary, certification program to push companies to think about beyond code, right? Let's talk about risk and resiliency of buildings. So I'd love your thoughts on this whole picture, right? Is that we're really addressing this. It's not something in the next month. It's, it will be years. And it is about reducing risk, but it's also about increasing host immunity and about resiliency. And I know you also talk a lot about pushing the field of IEQ and IAQ to look at these issues beyond air quality alone. So would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all wrapped up and related. And let's be clear, right now we're in a risk phase, right? So how do we minimize risk to a hazard that's pervasive and threatens all of us, and some certainly more than others? And in particular, low-income communities are being hit unbelievably hard. Senior homes are being hit hard. Prisons are being hit hard. And this gets to the thing about comorbidities and what are we trying to protect, and what does it mean to lead a healthy life, and how does that protect us beyond, let's say, the virus, or certainly can exacerbate the conditions or make it more likely that you'll suffer a severe adverse event. So it's all wrapped up in what it is to be healthy, and all of these things matter. And so the building has a role to play here too, beyond, let's say, indoor air quality and all these other factors. So the way I think about buildings, and this, by the way, this fits for homes and schools and every other indoor environment. And Rachel mentioned I do work on airplanes. We had an op-ed on cars last week with another researcher, Rich Corsi and Jack Spangler, talking about how to be healthy in a car. Right now. So we have to think about all of the ways that it's influencing our health. And the problem is it tends not to be in the discussion when we think about healthy living in the indoor environment. So for example, if I asked everyone, if we took a poll of 4,000 people and said, what does it mean to lead a healthy life? Everyone's going to say, oh, I got to exercise 30 minutes today, right? I got to squeeze that in somewhere. Everyone's going to say, well, I know what a healthy meal is like. I got to avoid these foods. I should eat more of these foods. Wow, outdoor air pollution, that's bad for you. We're all going to say the same things. Smoking, no good, right? We know this. We know this because it's been studied and documented for decades. These great human epidemiological cohort studies, the Harvard six city studies, Framingham Heart Study, Nurses Health Study. We don't have that for buildings and indoor air quality. So it's not a surprise then that when you ask people, well, how do I stay healthy? No one turns to that because we haven't had decades of messaging around these broader benefits. So right now, healthy living, people don't turn around and say, well, what about this room I'm in right now? Haven't really thought much about it, but today I'll spend 18 hours in this one room. Right? And so it's going to influence my health more than if I get exercise today. So, but it has been missing from the conversation. So it's largely because it has been underfunded, understudied. But I think that's about to change. I think these shifts in awareness about just how much the built environment is impacting our health, it's unavoidable. Everyone is now recognizing that. And hopefully it leads to a future where that becomes part of that. Maybe it's first in the conversation. You have to eat well, I do this. And what about what's going on in my house and my bedroom? I spend a third of my life in the bedroom. How do we fix that space?
Joe, I cannot hold this audience back. We've had well over 100 questions come in already, but I do have a few more that I want to put to you that are a little bit more personal before we start to address some of the flow of what people are putting into the queue. So I want to talk about resilience and personal resilience. Specifically yours. I feel like you never stop. Like I told somebody yesterday on my team, Joe Allen makes me feel like a slacker every time I wake up, and I'm an early riser. I have like 3 new tweets from you about 3 new studies that you've thoroughly reviewed or published yourself. So what are you doing to hold on to to cultivate your own resilience? You're a dad of 3. You're full-time parenting on top of this. How are you staying in the game? How are you keeping your energy up?
Yeah, so the way I'm keeping it up is, everything's on the line here. Everything I know and love, every person I know and love is at risk here. My kids' hopes and dreams are at risk. I'm actually getting emotional thinking about it. So, in terms of what keeps me, why am I up every day at 4 a.m. and reading science till the end of the night and thinking we have to get that next message out? That's what's driving me. It's everything I know and love and everyone I care for is at risk here. Millions of people have lost their lives. I feel quite lucky. I have a job. I have a house. We have food. This is not the case for everybody. And I'm concerned for everybody. And I guess I'm motivated thinking that, what's that next thing we have to do to get that next message out that might help turn the corner and be part of that, building blocks towards solutions here. I mean, honestly, that's what I'm motivated by. I'm also incredibly lucky. I have a wonderful wife. I have 3 great kids. It's a lot of work, like everybody knows who's home with kids right now. They're doing homeschooling 3 feet away from me. My son promises he's going to photobomb one of these soon. So, but we're all making it work, but I feel quite fortunate in what we have. I'm not complaining at all. These are inconveniences, but they're minor inconveniences. And I just think it's an all-in moment for everybody. If you're not going all out on this, everything's at stake. So this is what's really what's driving me.
Yeah, we fully agree. We've been saying it's an amazing thing to have a sense of purpose right now. It is the energy source, and also what a gift it is to be working on the thing that's taken up all of our attention and our mental attention anyway. What about silver linings? We've talked a lot about the COVID silver linings, and in fact, my deputy Michelle keeps a running list for the entire organization of the silver linings that are coming out of it. We've talked a little bit about the environmental silver linings. The animals are frolicking in the streets, the panda bears are making love, that all kinds of things happening that are good for the planet. But what about for us people? What are some of the silver linings of COVID?
So I have to say maybe, at a personal level, and you got me on this, so my brain is now, but it's a reconnection of the things that matter. These are the things that reset you. It's been a lot of work, but I really like also having lunch and dinner and breakfast with my kids. I like seeing them throughout the day. I don't miss the frantic rush in the morning of everybody getting out. So some of those, as always happens, and probably like most of you, I've reconnected, your true friends, your dear friends, even ones you haven't talked to in a while. I bet we've all reconnected with them. So that's some of the silver lining, let's say on a personal level, and maybe at a public health level. It's I hope this is the moment where we collectively see the value of investing in prevention, where across all diseases and problems we're facing, and public health has been chronically underinvested. If there's a problem, yeah, we go to the doctor. That's really important. But we spend a fortune treating the problem after the fact. We could treat it for a fraction of the cost up front. So a silver lining there is, I hope, is that public health comes out of this as an institution that we collectively as societies feel needs to be invested in and valued maybe more than it has been. So those are maybe the sources of some positive change that will come out of this.
I think
those are great answers.
Howard. So many people. And, it's really important that we find our voice right now. And I think a lot of us have the passion of this platform to really talk about why places matter. I've never met an architect or a designer or actually an engineer within building science that was required to take a course on health. I've never met a health professional that was within our own field, Joe, within public health or medicine, that was required to take the course. I know how hard you're working at Harvard to have there be a joint program for graduate students, so we're changing that, right? But oftentimes there's still electives, or for us at the International Building Institute, we offer the WELL AP training for a lot of professionals that are on the line that are really passionate about working between these fields. But oftentimes people feel like their voice isn't heard, or who do they talk to in the organization, or do they have enough education to go to the C-suite? Kevin Kamsher, a dear friend of ours, has written in, so we're so glad, Kevin, you can join us. And I think his question relates to this too, which is really about how do we empower our professionals with the education and training to be leaders right now, to be able to go to the C-suite, to be able to make the argument for how buildings matter in the fight against COVID. And Kevin specifically asking about the building manager that may not feel maybe as always empowered to go to the C-suite to make that argument, and how he's very interested in thinking about how to educate and inform some of our frontline workers, which for us are our building managers and people that are protecting our health in buildings. So I would love to hear you talk about how do we educate, empower, and really drive to inform our frontline workers as they return, such as building managers, to inform and provide safe environments for their workers.
Yeah, nice question. Thanks, Kevin. So I know the terrific work he does at GSA with him and his team. So, if there was ever a moment right now, if there's ever a moment, it is right now, where if you're thinking, how could I get the CEO's attention? I'm a facilities person. I can never. This is the moment. I just start knocking on that door right now. They'll listen to you. The number of people. A number of CEOs I've spoken to in the past 2 weeks across every sector has been shocking, because all of a sudden everyone says, hey, what's that healthy buildings thing you're talking about? We got to know about that. Who's our facilities team? And the companies that have invested there are already, in my view, or what I'm seeing, are doing well. In other words, the companies that have the engineers and the people who have been thinking about this and the systems in place, largely that come from the sustainability group, that have these networks across their company. They can talk across the silos within a company already. They can bring in some of that science and expertise, are being very effective at getting the CEO's attention to say, this is our way out of this. It turns out the building really matters. So the moment is right now to knock on that door and say, hey, we're here, and actually we're a core function. And our job is not just, fix the dampers, chase down some minor energy things. It's actually a health function. And in that regard, it's a core function of your business. It is a core function of your business. I say it all the time. The person who manages your building has a greater impact on your health than your doctor. You are part of that mission in getting the company reestablished. So the time is right now. I would say in terms of what else you can do, I spent early this morning doing an education session with a company who wisely, in my opinion, wanted some of the basics to be given to their frontline people out in the buildings. And I don't mean just COVID basics. So let's set up a series of education sessions, a couple hundred people on the line. Tell us about public health. Tell us about examples in history. Sure, tell us about infectious disease transmission. Tell us about PPE. All of a sudden, these things that were usually the boring, well, you're in public health, right? We've heard these lectures 100. John Snow, all right, I've heard that, I've heard that 100 times by the time you graduated out of public health. That's really important right now. And so some leaders are really taking it and saying, hey, I want to arm my frontline people with this information so they can talk more effectively. The people are going to be asking them the questions, so it just doesn't become these questions that have to go back to find someone like me to answer and cycle through. Arm them with this information. The other executives are seeing this as a market opportunity. Say, guess what? I'm going to come out of this and I'm going to win. I'm going to lead. I'm going to be the first one talking about this. Saying, hey, everyone on my team knows about what public health is, and they can answer your questions. We're the company that you should feel good coming back to. So, a lot wrapped up in that one. Yeah.
For sure there is. I just went through 5 different questions in my head, and you asked and answered most of them. But on the front of COVID silver linings, I think up until COVID-19, a lot of us were feeling like public health was the responsibility of elected and appointed officials. And now we're coming to a place where we're really realizing just how interdependent and codependent we are on one another and one another's good behaviors. And you're seeing a lot of folks from, C-suite executives down to, the people who deliver your groceries really think about the role that they have to play in supporting the broader health of the public. I want to talk about some of the folks who maybe fall off of our radar in a lot of these conversations. There's a question that came in about equity, and I know that this is a topic that's close to your heart. I'll read the question. We've all seen how inequity in health has impacted who has perished from COVID-19. Can you please address issues of equity in the healthy building movement? Much of the focus is on relatively wealthy companies and workplaces. For people who could work remotely, for instance, how can the healthy building movement address places like public schools, factories, commercial kitchens, construction?
Yeah, great question. And this is definitely near to my heart. I think if you're in public health, it's near to your heart and part of your mission. And certainly we're seeing, like with any crisis, this one is showing the gross inequities and the problems that we have here. And in fact, we need to turn our attention fast and hard towards protecting these populations who are being impacted disproportionately. It's a gross failing so far. It is a gross failing, and we see it in the hard data. It's no longer, well, maybe this will happen. This is happening. We knew it would happen, and we're not doing enough. So that's on that side. I totally agree that this healthy building movement will be a failure, an entire failure, if it's confined to elite buildings in top cities, whatever you define that. It's a problem. I'm confident, really confident, that we can drive this throughout the entire market. Because these strategies make sense for everybody. It's not that, if it only benefited a certain sector and they said, well, that's why we'll pursue it. That the value proposition is there for us. The value proposition is there for everybody. Schools, factories, food service, you name it, the value proposition is there. And the benefits so far outweigh the costs that there shouldn't be a barrier to adopting these anywhere and everywhere. That said, right now, a lot of the first stage here is these are confined to maybe new shiny buildings that have the money to, or the perceived, extra cost to achieve these. But what we're seeing now is that other players are coming to the market. This will quickly move, and these healthy building strategies will propagate, and they have to. It's a total misnomer that only shiny, healthy new buildings can be healthy buildings. I spent a career doing forensic investigations and resolving sick buildings, have seen the worst of the worst buildings, totally neglected for decades, and with just a little bit of attention, and I mean really a little bit of attention onto the systems and the processes in the building, you can turn the worst building into a healthy building. So it gives me hope. It's not that if it was only possible to do in a brand new building, that'd be problematic. That's just not the case.
Let's talk about money. And let's talk about this idea that healthy buildings are optional. We hear it all too often. What's the business case? Tell me that if I spend more, I get more. Tell me that you can prove that if I spent more, that this is going to make people healthier, or that healthy buildings are expensive. And I just want to once and for all say they're not if we do them right. But I do want to talk to you because I know, Joe, you're really interested in who are the stakeholders. So when it comes down to making this happen across the globe, how do we start getting into the conversation around money, right? And so I know you've done some work now, are interested, even when we look at the investor level, to say, okay, if you're running these factories, right, if you have companies with 100 different buildings, how do we drive transparency to show that you're investing in the health of people, right? How can we show that you're doing the right thing? And the other side of that is, if you're not, is there a risk? And those risks are showing up now. And I think, we really believe in public health. That is, when you're investing for health, right, you are investing for your people. And that's really showing up now. So I would just love kind of building on that comment that, healthy building is not an option, right? This should be what is given to all populations, and that if we need to follow the money and we need to follow the drivers, how do we think of the stakeholders who can make the biggest change in really creating transparency of where they're investing for health for all their populations?
Yeah, so good comment, and I've been really cognizant and in fact intentional about my own research efforts and partnering with my friend and colleague John Macomber at the business school, Harvard Business School, co-authoring the book. And I'll tell you about what we do there that's relevant to this conversation, but also in giving home and away lectures. I lecture at the business school. He lectures to the School of Public Health, so we can understand these systems and know the drivers so we can affect change. We have a new Harvard Business School case study coming out on 425 Park Avenue, where we evaluate these economic drivers. The economics are such that the benefits so far outweigh the costs, and the evidence is so deep that at this point, I could point you to 100 great references, and not just pointing to my book here, but we walk through even pro formas for businesses and say, if you make these decisions, this is the impact, and it's all grounded in the science. So we know these benefits exist. I've written in Harvard Business Review maybe 3-4 years ago on the economics, 2 orders of magnitude benefit to cost, even on one factor, ventilation rates. So in the book, we then take it a step further to your point about, well, how do we understand who's making those decisions? There's a really important chapter there, and John does this in my class, where he walks through the value-added chain. Who's making decisions? What does that process look like? If you're in the healthy building space, you don't know what that looks like. Maybe you're coming at it from the health side. You need to understand that to know which lever you should be pulling on. And once you do that, then you know where to target your efforts. Right now, what I'm seeing, to your question of where's this coming from, who's driving this, sure, it's happening at the investor level. This has been happening for a couple of years. You saw the turn towards ESG. Big investment groups were starting to ask the question, not just how do I invest in green, how do I invest in healthy, how do you define that even? It's a little trickier, and show me objectively how to do that. There are bottom-up pressures too. I talk about an example in the book where I was talking to a buildings person who, for the first time in this person's career, he got a call from HR. Top talent was coming in, wanted to know about their building. Was it a healthy building? HR is like, we have healthy buildings? I don't know. What does that even mean? So it tells you that this pressure is coming up. We talk all the time. Well, it's a recruitment tool. You retain and attract top talent. Well, there's an example of it in action, real, major company, right? Trying to recruit top talent, wants to know what space am I getting? It was one of the things when I got when I applied to Harvard and I got this faculty job, one of the things I negotiated on was my office. I knew which office I wanted. I knew why. I love it. So, people are making decisions around this too. So you have the top-down pressure, bottom-up pressure, and hopefully it'll kind of shift the whole market here.
Can I just add on to Whitney's question, Joe, which I think is related. When I think back in the birth of the green building movement, there was so much that we wanted the market to pull forward. We didn't want it to be a regulatory kind of event. When I look at what's going on now in nursing homes, think of the future of schools for our children, underserved markets, do you think we'll move towards a point where regulation will take over with an absolute as far as building performance versus just market driven if you have the funds to do it or not?
It's a really good question. I think I'm an optimist, but I think I have to be realistic here. I don't necessarily see that that's going to be the path forward here, and why we haven't done it in the past. I think it's problematic. The standards so far have been slow. Hopefully, the demand will create, so people want standardization. So we have to come up with codes that, for example, schools, right, really tricky and underperforming in the U.S. Across the board, nearly, not across the board, but yeah, largely chronically underventilated. But I don't know if that, from a regulatory standpoint, it's going to come in unless the demand comes from from people saying, hey, look, this is the end of this era where, these underperforming buildings were on time. What is this? But I think people have largely not ignored it, just we haven't paid much attention to it. So, but I'm not hopeful. I like what's happening in the market where even on thinking about choosing healthier materials and healthier products, the market's moving way past the regulatory apparatus. And hopefully they'll put us out of business in public health where, okay, look, everything's healthy, no more. It's not a decision of this or this, is this bad? It's like, no, this is good for you and you have to do it. And in fact, this becomes the norm in terms of constructing new schools and any other place. It just becomes the norm, right? There's no reason not to do it an unhealthy way. It costs more to do it the unhealthy way, right? It doesn't cost more to create a healthy building. And in fact, you're reducing future liability and risk. It should be a no-brainer. It just hasn't been. It just hasn't been.
Joe, man, does time fly on the line with you? We've been trying to kind of bundle people's questions into our questions to you to cover as much ground as we can. So we thought we'd end with a couple of rapid-fire questions. Monica's going to cue up a visual. It's the 10 concepts of well. And I want to ask you a series of kind of rapid fire questions as it relates to these. So as Monica's queuing it up, my first question is, across the 10 concepts of well, what are the 3 most important concepts for us to be thinking about right now in terms of COVID-19 response?
COVID-19. So definitely air quality. You have to address airborne transmission. You should be thinking about you should be thinking about, I think you should be thinking about all modes of transmission right there. So you have the movement category, the movement of people. This is administrative control largely. Maybe you're thinking of movement in terms of physical activity. I'm thinking of movement of people through spaces. I think you're gonna have to think about water quality as these buildings are stagnant, like I mentioned earlier. But I really don't like the idea of trying to rank things too much. It's going to depend on your building too and your situation, but we have to be pursuing all of them at all times, in my opinion.
How about, of all of these 10, which one do you think will be the most challenging for us to address coming out of COVID-19 and the pandemic?
I don't think any are particularly challenging, to be honest. That may not be a satisfactory answer, but we know what works, and we know how to do these things. So this is not, I often say I'm in the field of common sense. I don't think any of this is all that challenging, to be totally frank.
How about looking at these 10 concepts, 2 of the concepts where you see the most promise in terms of innovations, whether it's thinking or technology, and name the thinking or technology?
Wow. I think we're about to turn the corner in terms of material health. That's a movement that has been really slow, unrelated to COVID, but I see a light at the end there, and I think the market is moving pretty fast in that space. So, and that's not there's some technology behind that, but I just think that's making a little bit better decisions in terms of what we do with our buildings. Yeah, I don't know about on the technology. there's some advancements in terms of building systems for ventilation and thermal comfort that are quite neat, where we'll get to the place where we can disentangle ventilation from thermal. I mean, this has been a goal for a long time. So maybe those two. I'm trying to give you rapid responses so we can crank through these.
We knew you could handle this one. We told you we were going to spring something on you toward the end here, so here it is. Okay, next question related to all of these, and there's a ton of questions that we've gotten from the audience on this. People just want to know, like, just tell me what I need to do. So across all of the different categories, what are the 3 most important things that we need to be thinking about for building re-entry? And then I'm going to ask you the same thing in terms of long-standing enhancements to the basement.
Yeah, so look, I've written about this, and I point people to the New York Times article and a Financial Times article in early February, which gives you tips to what you should be doing in your building to fight disease. This gets to what we were talking about, enhanced ventilation, filtration. You could think about humidification, a little harder to do with existing. You have to include this cleaning, enhanced cleaning and disinfection. That has to be part of it. And importantly, it's not just the building. It has to be paired with these administrative controls on dedensification. And all of this is going to involve social trust. You know, this is not related to the building, but people's actions, right? It's going to be a privilege to get back onto the beach or at a park or back in buildings. And if we abuse that privilege in terms of not keeping our space, not covering your cough, going out when you're not feeling sick, well, these privileges are going to be revoked. I shouldn't say that in a free and open society, but really, we'll have to have more restrictions placed on us to control this unless we all act responsibly. So it's partly the building, but I want to be clear when we talk about COVID-19, it is a larger responsibility than one group or one entity. Absolutely.
Okay, so last question on these visuals, and then I'll have one more closing question before I turn it back over to Monica to close us out. Long-term measures. What are the 3 most important things that are longer-term investments that we can be making in our buildings to fortify them against any future viral outbreaks, and just more broadly to get us to that healthy building vision?
Yeah, you know, it may not even be, I'm not going to give you 3, I'm going to give you 1, and it's not even going to have to do with the building. You need to, maybe to Kevin's point, empower someone in the organization to say, we're going to elevate the role of the person who's responsible for the building to be one that's core to the function of the organization. It is clear that how your company is going to survive going forward is going to depend on who is making those decisions around your property. So around all of those, it's going to be more important is, have you empowered that person and elevated that role to be a critical and core function in your organization?
Amazing answer. We have a pilot feature, a beta feature in Wells that elevates the role of the chief wellness officer. And same with green building. We think you want to address healthy buildings, you got to make it somebody's job. And then you've got to position that person with authority and influence in the organization. Okay, final question for you. And this is back to a more personal note. It's something that I'm asking the most sage and wise people that I have access to in my life. Is it possible to thrive in this moment? And honestly, when I look at you, I've never seen you more alive, and you've not had it easy. You're burning the candle at both ends. Your sister came down with COVID-19, so this has hit really close to home. But like, is it possible to thrive in this moment? And if so, do you have any advice?
I'm not sure I can give advice there, but I'll tell you, is it possible to thrive? That answer is definitely yes. And people are thriving in all sorts of ways, right? So, you know, I talked about this being an all-in moment for the world and society. I like what my dean says, you know, whatever your skill, whatever your passion, there's a place for you in public health. So whatever your skill or passion, there's a place for you right now. And you can thrive by helping others. I mean, honestly, I think that's really what it comes down to is how you're serving other people. And in moments like this, it really matters more than ever. And I mean, you know, if you're a comedian, like, get out there, make us laugh. If you're an artist, bring some joy and light to the world. If you're a teacher, teach. I'm a scientist. I'll keep doing the science. You know, business people have to come up with these creative ideas, how to restart the economy. Everyone has a role to play here. So it's the biggest all-in moment we've ever had. And in that way, you know, that's the way we can actually thrive individually, but also collectively.
Thank you for landing us on that positive and hopeful note. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I knew that it was going to be a rapid fire and engaging conversation, but it's clearly exceeded our expectations and a lot of those who have tuned in. Lots of amazing feedback coming in through the Q&A panel. Joe, really above all, thank you for the work that you're doing and the novel way in which you approach these problems with such a solutions-oriented way of thinking and such an evolved way of approaching the notion of the role of researcher in modern society, the role of scientists in modern society. So thank you so much from the bottom of all of our hearts at IWBI. And I'm going to turn it back over to Monica, who has just a couple of procedural things to walk us through before we sign off for the day. And thanks to those who chimed in and who submitted questions. I hope we got a chance to answer a good chunk of them, but we always appreciate you spending some time with us, especially on a Friday. Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Whitney, Joe, Rick, as well. This was an incredible dialogue to listen to here. I couldn't help, as you were wrapping up, just looking at the thread start to rise as everyone's saying, this is one of the best webinars, and Joe, this is amazing. And I encourage you, Joe, if you have a moment here, to go and look at all of the amazing comments, and really appreciate all of you telling us what you think. I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for our next webcast session with Dr. Esther Sternberg. It's going to be focused on the intersection between stress and immunity. Dr. Sternberg is actually a best-selling author as well as the research director of the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona. So we're very excited to have her. She's going to talk a lot about the interrelationship between place, stress, and immunity, as well as different strategies you can bring into your workplace to help both balance the two together. So we're really excited to have her. I've already sent out the link in the chat, but you'll also receive it in the follow-up email if you're interested in registering and joining us. As always, if you are a member of the Places Matter series, you'll be automatically registered next week for the session. Just a quick reminder here that we still are offering reduced pricing on the WELL AP credential. Right now it's $299 for the WELL AP exam and $349 for the exam prep bundle. And we'll be donating 20% of all WELL AP exam registration fees to Doctors Without Borders. And also we are offering additional reduced pricing for $99 with IWBI covering the difference for students as well as those who may have lost their job related to COVID-19. So I encourage you to check this out at wellcertified.com/wellap. We'd love to have you join the community. And if the term WELL AP sounds new to you, I encourage you to learn more about it. We're very excited. We're hosting 3 global sessions where we're featuring WELL APs from around the world to tell you what it is like to actually be a WELL AP, from studying for the exam to actually supporting a project through WELL certification. They'll share all their tips and tricks. And so our first session is actually featuring WELL APs from Australia. It'll be next week, May 6th at 10 p.m. Eastern, or the Australian Family Time of May 7th at 12 p.m. AEST. This session will actually feature Stantec's Alexander Kovler, Energy and Sustainability Services Melinda Mandla, and NDY's Haley Corbin. If you can't make that time, or maybe you're interested in hearing from WELL APs in a different part of the world, we are also hosting sessions with WELL APs from Europe as well as North America in the coming weeks. We'll just give you all the information you need to register for this and upcoming WELL AP experience sessions in the follow-up email as well. And with that, on behalf of the entire IWBI team and everyone here on the line, I'd like to thank you for tuning into today's session. We hope that you continue to hold your loved ones tight, and we hope that we can see you again next week for another engaging dialogue and continue to talk about why place matters together. Have a great one, everybody. Bye. Thank you again, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Amazing.